welcome all of you. I presume that many of you are Virginia Woolf or Sylvia Plath fans. We're sort of curious as to where the balance, but we're not going to ask you to indicate your preferences. And we also have people on Zoom tonight. Welcome to you as well. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today because he has spoken to us, well, we think 6 times so far, and he is a lover of literature, and his appreciation of literature comes to the fore, and so you feel it's meaningful when he gives a talk, that he's done so much research, just a few indicators of how much research he has actually done. And his sort of style of doing it is to have him make the presentation and then 3 readers, right, to embellish the, hopefully. I'm Sylvia Plath, Betty Sujar, and then we have Virginia Woolf over here in the form of Jill and Tabitha Ross. So we'll all be proceeding tonight. And so John Chambers is our speaker, who was at King Edward's for many years as the senior head of English there. And he's now retired, and thankfully he's been spending time preparing this talk. So can we welcome John Chambers?
I just want to add one thing to Betty's introduction. Tabitha Ross is reading the creative work of Sylvia Plath and one poem, whereas Betty is reading the letters and journal of Sylvia Plath, and in between we have Virginia Woolf. 2025 is the centenary of Virginia Woolf's 4th novel, Mrs. Dalloway, the 2nd of her modernist phase, which was increasingly preoccupied with the inner worlds of her characters. Is set on a single day in the middle of June in 1923 and has 2 parallel narratives. One focusing on Clarissa Dalloway, the Westminster wife of a Conservative MP, who spends her day preparing. Is this making funny noises? Am I too close? Okay. One of the narratives focusing on Clarissa Dalloway, the Westminster wife of a Conservative MP, who spends her day preparing for her party by doing practical things, but also reflecting and so growing in complexity, particularly when reminiscing about the past as an old boyfriend, Peter Walsh, is back in town. But this is also the story of the final day in the life of Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked soldier who has become suicidal and is being taken by his Italian wife, Rezia, to Harley Street to see Sir William Bradshaw, a nerve specialist. At the end, these 2 narrative strands converge at the party when Sir William mentions Septimus's suicide to Richard Dalloway, who is working on a parliamentary bill concerned with the deferred effects of shell shock. Clarissa's reaction to this news is hard to summarize. She instinctively finds Sir William obscurely evil, capable of some indescribable outrage, forcing your soul, that was it. And there is certainly empathy, as she herself has an awful fear in the depths of her heart about getting through her life. But she must go back to her party. Life goes on. It is a tribute to Woolf's brilliant and original novel that just over 20 years later, it was the first novel of hers, which a bright young student in America, Sylvia Plath, encountered in her high school English class. The effect was electrifying. And in this talk, I shall trace the chronological story of Virginia Woolf's influence on Sylvia Plath, which lasted for the rest of her life. So I want to begin with a brief quotation of Plath's letters, written to one of her boyfriends, Gordon LeMayer, 4 years later when she was 21, as it contains the phrase which provides the title of this talk, and it also illustrates Plath's love of writing fluent and vivid prose.
As always, I'm luxuriant and replete in the green haven of my secluded backyard, private enough to sit like a cross-legged Buddha on the chaise lounge before my typewriter, clad in a halter and shorts, to write and study. All the Virginia Woolf delight in a symphony of unrelated sound, sight, and flavor, being sympathicized into an ecstatic unity by the observer, a sort of Mrs. Dalloway-Plath here.
There are still various myths about Plath, one being that she made her name after meeting Ted Hughes, and it is central to this talk to realize that by the time she came to continue her literary studies in England, when she was 22, she had already not only published many poems, but also many short stories, earning substantial amounts of much needed money in the process. For example, $500 prize money for Sunday at the Mintons from the magazine Mademoiselle in 1952. As Al Alvarez wrote in the Cambridge Mind, for an undergraduate, her list of acknowledgements from professional magazines was prodigious. And what is also central to this talk is to realize that she always had just as great an interest in writing fiction as she had in composing poetry, and a growing ambition to write novels. She started 2, Falcon Yard and Double Exposure, and completed 1, The Bell Jar, which was published in 1963. Plath was fortunate in having Wilbury Crockett as her high school English teacher, and she wrote how he fostered her intellectual life, both in socio-political areas and also in a very broad-based literary curriculum. Most particularly, it was studying Mrs. Dalloway, which had a profound effect on her, and, for example, introduced her to Woolf's stream of consciousness approach to narrative. Her excitement is revealed in these lines from an unpublished high school essay of hers on Mrs. Dalloway. You jump about from one person's disconnected train of thought to another's. Imagine that you could peer into the brain of any passerby at will. There is an echo of this in her short story Sunday at the Mintons, where, in order to get under her pompous brother's skin, Elizabeth tries to say something fanciful about wanting to lift up the tops of people's heads, like teapot lids, and peer inside to find out what they are thinking. But all she gets as a reply is a smug witticism. The 2 readings which follow shortly illustrate this initial psychological influence that Plath's novel had on an early short story, Woolf's novel had on an early short story of Plath's. The first extract is very near the beginning of Mrs. Dalloway and captures Clarissa's delight in this London moment as her important day begins.
Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. Heaven only knows why we love it so, how one sees it so. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp and trudge, in the bellow and uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some aeroplane overhead, was what she loved. Life, London, this moment in June.
The second extract is from Plath's story, A Day in June. In it, she conveys the experience of a young girl out on the water in a canoe by using the stream of consciousness approach, but doing so slightly differently to Woolf, as it is written in the rarely used second person, you lie back, rather than the third person, as in she thought.
It's one of those perfect days in June you try to describe, but never quite can. The dazzle, the hot touch of sun on your skin, blinding arrows of sunlight glancing off the deep glassed blue of water. The exhilaration, bubbles rising, bursting, the gliding motion, the liquid singing of water past the bow, shifting specks of color dancing. All this to love, to cherish. Never again such a day. You paddle to a cove, you drift, you lie back and close your eyes against the sunlight, hot upon the lids, lulled by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the prow, the rocking, the gliding. You drift near the shore.
The two passages share several characteristics. Most obviously, the month of June and the elevated sensation of both characters, but also the immediacy of the style, the use of present tense phrases like crossing Victoria Street and bubbles rising, and the alliterative clusters of sound in the bellow and uproar and lulled by the lapping, and in the exclamations, Big Ben strikes there, and never again such a day. Plath included 2 exclamation marks. Over 10 years later, Mrs. Dalloway was to have a very different kind of influence on Plath's novel, The Bell Jar, one responding particularly to the distress and suicide of Septimus Smith, which I will consider later, though there is not time to record the many interesting connections between them, which critics like Tracy Brain and the other Sylvia Plath have discussed. The second novel of Woolf's, which made a strong impression on Plath, was To the Lighthouse, which she was introduced to at Smith College, where she was from the age of 18 to 22, by Elizabeth Drew. This novel is primarily a portrait of Woolf's parents, one that her sister Vanessa Bell found remarkably convincing, who are fictionalized as Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. The first part introduces the large Ramsay family of 8 children and their 6 guests, and is set on one day before the First War, at their summer house on the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides, a location based on the Stevens family holidays at Talland House in St. Ives. Plath was also deeply attached to the sea, as from the age of 4 till 10, she lived in the coastal town of Winthrop in Massachusetts, near her grandparents, whose telephone number at the time was Ocean 1212W, which she used as the title of her radio memoir of that period. I sometimes think my vision of the sea is the clearest thing I own. In Sunday at the Mintons, which was published while she was still at Smith's, there seem to be several echoes of Woolf's novel. For example, Henry and Elizabeth, though brother and sister, have certain similar characteristics to Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. He chants grace, she smells something burning. But perhaps most memorable is the descriptive background of the waves, which haunt both Mrs. Ramsay and Elizabeth. And the juxtaposition of these 2 passages suggests Woolf and Plath's shared experience of this elemental feature of their childhoods. Firstly, To the Lighthouse, and then from Sunday at the Mintons.
Mrs. Ramsay listened, but it was all very still. There was only the sound of the sea. She saw the light again. It silvered the rough waves a little more brightly, as daylight faded, and the blue went out of the sea, and it rolled in waves of pure lemon, which curved and swelled and broke upon the beach, and waves of pure delight raced over the floor of her mind.
On a fine day, if the windows were open, Elizabeth could hear the waves fall. One would crash and go slipping back, and then another and another. On some nights, when she was lingering, half awake, about to be engulfed in sleep, she would hear the waves. And then the wind would begin in the trees, and she could not tell one sound from the other.
To the lighthouse is divided into 3 parts. Woolf's image was of an H. Part 1, 1 day before the war. Time passes 10 years, 2 days after the war. The climax of the first part is Mrs. Ramsay's dinner party, and it gave Plath an idea which she was to return to several times, the idea of how people can challenge life's fluidity and flux. Shakespeare did it poetically in the 300-year-old sonnet which Mrs. Ramsay is reading in our last view of her. But she does it in a personal way through the creation of her memorable dinner party, reflecting afterwards that her guests, however long they lived, would come back to this night.
Now all the candles were lit, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight and composed, as they had not been in the twilight, into a party round a table, for the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here, inside the room, seemed to be order and dry land. There, outside, a reflection in which things wavered and vanished waterily. They had their common cause against that fluidity out there.
This special occasion has been observed by Lily Briscoe, the most self-effacing of the house guests, who spends much of her time concentrating on painting a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay, who she feels deeply drawn to, but also finds rather mysterious. The second part of the novel contains a lyrical description of the passage of time, which it takes its toll on the family, and during which Mrs. Ramsay dies, and the eldest son, Andrew, dies on the Western Front, and the eldest daughter, Prue, marries but dies of some illness connected with childbirth. The third part is set over 2 days, 10 years later, just after the war, when Lily Briscoe returns with 2 other guests. Initially, she is rather overpowered by Mr. Ramsay, though she begins to understand him better, and he has changed to become less tyrannical. And while he is finally taking his children to the lighthouse, she begins another painting of Mrs. Ramsay, wondering what is the meaning of it all. As she is doing this, she experiences an epiphany in which Mrs. Ramsay appears to her, and Lily at last fully understands what she has stood for.
The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck in the dark. Here was one, Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together. Mrs. Ramsay saying, "Life stands still here." Mrs. Ramsay, making of the moment something permanent. As in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. This was of the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos, there was shape, this eternal passing and flowing. She looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking, was struck into stability. Life stand still here, Mrs. Ramsay said. She owed this revelation to her.
And this idea of making of the moment something permanent would come to haunt Plath, and which she would connect with the third of Woolf's novels, which would particularly impress her, The Waves, which she would read before her return to America after 2 academic years in England. When at the age of 22 in 1955, Sylvia Plath arrived in Cambridge on a Fulbright scholarship, she wrote home to her mother Aurelia, "Amusingly enough, all of the scholarship boys I know think of me as a second Virginia Woolf." She was very thrilled and flattered by this comparison, as her great literary predecessor had already become for her an important figure. And she was now based at Newnham College, where Woolf had read the first paper that led to A Room of One's Own, a copy of which Plath bought. Some months later, she wrote in her journal,
I picked up The Blessed Diary of Virginia Woolf, which I bought with a battery of her novels on Saturday. She works on her depression over rejections from Harper's, no less, by cleaning out the kitchen and cooks haddock and sausage, bless her. I feel my life linked to her somehow. I love her.
Plath was extremely busy during these 2 years with a demanding academic course, a new social circle, her romantic relationship with Ted Hughes, and to protect her scholarship, their secret marriage. Her most interesting connection with Woolf during this time was her short story, The Wishing Box, which Tracy Brain has called a direct revision of Woolf's late story, The Legacy, which was published posthumously in The Haunted House and Other Stories, which Plath had a copy of. There is not time this evening to focus on these 2 compelling stories with their shared theme of the destructive effect of marriage on a wife's creativity, the one possibly prophetic and the other perhaps retrospective. But there are striking details which connect them and differing views about interpreting them. Are they allegorical or autobiographical? Shortly before Plath and Hughes left Cambridge in the summer of 1957 to go to America, where she was to teach at Smith's, she bought some of Woolf's novels and towards the end of July told her mother that she had read 3 in 1 week. One of these would be The Waves, and this next extract from Plath's journal, in which she indirectly quotes Bernard, the most creative and literary of the 6 characters in Woolf's novel. Lyndall Gordon calls him Woolf's spokesman, conveys her excitement at the recurrence of the idea of making of the moment something permanent.
The moment of illumination, fusion, creation. We make this against the whole falling apart away and the coming again to make and make in the face of flux. Making of the moment something of permanence. This is the life work. I underlined and underlined, reread that. Words will stay the flux. My life, I feel, will not be lived until there are books and stories which relive it permanently in time.
In the novel, two great artistic examples for Bernard of making of the moment something permanent are Hampton Court's architecture and Beethoven's music, which Woolf had been listening to while writing it. This had become a key phrase for Plath, and for her the recurrence of this idea linked Woolf's view of art into the lighthouse with the waves. And it is this latter novel which was the most annotated of those she possessed. Woolf had called it a play poem. It seems to have influenced some of Plath's aerial poems. Its main influence, though, was not on her fiction, but on her radio drama, Three Women, who resemble the three in the waves, Susan, Rhoda, and Ginny. Its setting is a maternity ward where the three unnamed women speak their soliloquies as they face their three different destinies. Two choose theirs, motherhood and abortion. One suffers a miscarriage. In spite of its radical subject matter, it was broadcast very successfully by the BBC in 1962. And I'm very surprised there isn't a professional recording of it available on a CD. With this drama, as well as poetry and short stories, Plath's versatility was now beginning to emerge. And in this same year, her final one, she managed to complete The Bell Jar. It was Mrs. Dalloway that again was to be influential. But before considering one connection between them, I want to briefly illustrate how Woolf haunted Plath's thoughts as she tried to concentrate on her ambition to become a novelist, an achievement which took much longer than she expected. These reflections from her letters and journal are a good starting point.
Have read 3 Virginia Woolf novels this week and find them excellent stimulation for my own writing. I hope to get 2 short stories off to the Saturday Evening Post and then begin on my novel. Virginia Woolf helps. Her novels make mine possible. I find myself describing episodes. You don't have to follow your Judith Greenwood to breakfast, lunch, dinner, or tell about the train ride, unless the flash forwards her, reveals her. This my call, my work. This gives my being a name, a meaning, to make the moment something permanent.
Though she had made some progress with her Cambridge novel, Falcon Yard, the name of where she and Ted Hughes met, the seeds of what would become The Bell Jar had been sown before the Hugheses left America after 2 years to return to England at the end of 1959. Plath had read 2 mental health stories in Cosmopolitan and had resolved to write an asylum story. In June, she recorded in her journal that as there was an increasing market for mental hospital stuff, she was a fool if she didn't relive and recreate her traumatic experiences of the second half of 1953, when unable to cope with being rejected for the writing course at Harvard, she had become deeply depressed, attempted suicide and very nearly succeeded, and finally spent 5 months in Maclean's hospital. With this idea for an autobiographical novel in mind, she was excited at the prospect of going back to England, looking forward to becoming a mother and confident of making more progress, especially literary progress. Frida was born over here in the April of 1960, and on the literary front, Plath mentioned in her letters home to her mother Aurelia 3 occasions on which she met people who had known Woolf. 1, cocktails with John Lehman, who had worked at the Hogarth Press and reminisced about Virginia Woolf and would publish some of her writing. 2, an evening with the T.S. Eliots, where the talk was intimate gossip about Stravinsky, Auden, Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence, which fascinated her, and she floated in to dinner. 3, 6 months later, there was dinner at the Spenders, where she met Louis MacNeice, who had produced The Waves for the BBC, and Rosamond Lehman, where the conversation was fascinating, all about Virginia Woolf. And in the next year, 1961, Plath managed to finish the bell jar very rapidly after a sleepless night when she was seized with some fearsome excitement at seeing how it could be done. 3 decisions she made were of paramount importance. Firstly, she decided to use a narrator, Esther Greenwood, who is in most respects her alter ego. And secondly, she chose to write it in a colloquial, deliberately very un-Woolfian first-person narrative style, which she had been working on. Writing in her journal, she had wondered, what is my voice? Wolfish, alas, but tough, please, tough. Finding her voice was a radical step towards embarking on her novel. And the third decision that Plath made was the choice of a memorable title, The Bell Jar, which is a symbol of the constraints that affect the mental health of Esther Greenwood. Living under the bell jar distorts your view of life, and you lose your sense of identity. This theme connects it with Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus Smith. Plath had also read Mary Jane Ward's The Snake Pit, a 1946 autobiographical novel about the author's period in a psychiatric hospital, which had been enormously influential. And I think she saw herself contributing to a fictional tradition of writers, Woolf, Ward, and then herself, who could deal sensitively and truthfully on the basis of their own experience with the deeply serious but previously ignored area of people with mental health issues. Heather Clark believes that it was Septimus Smith who was Plath's favorite character in the novel. And in this extract from Mrs. Dalloway, Razia, his Italian wife, who is desperately worried about the mental state of her husband, who was so courageous in the war, but is now becoming suicidal, has managed to get him an appointment with the distinguished Harley Street doctor, Sir William Bradshaw. At one point, 3 of Woolf's 4 doctors were knights of the realm, and there is a distinctly satirical edge to this scene.
Sir William Bradshaw could see the first moment they came into the room. The Warren Smiths, they were called. It was a case of extreme gravity. It was a case of complete breakdown. If Mr. Smith would wait, said Sir William, he would speak to Mrs. Smith in the next room. Her husband was very seriously ill, Sir William said. Did he try to kill himself? Oh, he did, she cried. But he did not mean it, she said. Of course not. It was merely a question of rest, said Sir William. Of rest, rest, rest. A long rest in bed. There was a delightful home down in the country where her husband would be perfectly looked after. Away from her? She asked. Unfortunately, yes. The people we care for are not good for us when we are ill. So they returned to Septimus Warren Smith, who sat in the armchair under the skylight, staring at a photograph of Lady Bradshaw in court dress. Was there anything else they wished to ask him? If not, then trust everything to me, he said, and dismissed them. Never, never had Razia felt such agony in her life. She had asked for help and been deserted.
I suspect that for Plath, returning to Woolf's novel nearly 10 years after having first read it, and in the light of her own subsequent breakdown, attempted suicide and hospitalization in 1953, she would have certainly understood Woolf's personal difficulty in writing about Septimus's insanity in the light of her own experience of madness. And she had probably read her diary entry. "The mad part tires me so much, makes my mind squint so badly that I can hardly face the next weeks at it." And she would also have particularly appreciated how Woolf's creation of Septimus's fear of the institutional treatment that lay ahead was what drove him to take the final step to end his life. In the bell jar, after becoming depressed and suicidal, failing her failure to get on the writing course, Esther visits Dr. Gordon with her mother at his private mental hospital. And this abridged reading of the scene contains several disturbing similarities to Septimus Smith's visit to Sir William Bradshaw, and is a clear example of Woolf's imprint on Plath. The authorial view of both doctors is one of disdain for these inflated professional egos dealing with their suicidal patients. In both, there are family photographs on their large desks. In both, the patients is decided behind their backs. And in both cases, this will mean having to live apart from those nearest and dearest to them. But no satire in this next reading, as Plath conveys the pain of experience through Esther's narration.
Dr. Gordon twiddled a silver pencil. "Your mother tells me you are upset." I curled in the cavernous leather chair and faced Dr. Gordon across an acre of highly polished desk. I hated him the minute I walked in through the door. He was young and good-looking, and I could see right away he was conceited. Dr. Gordon had a photograph on his desk in a silver frame that half faced him and half faced my leather chair. It was a family photograph, and it showed a beautiful dark-haired woman smiling out over the heads of two blonde children. For some reason, the photograph made me furious. Dr. Gordon said, "I think I would like to speak to your mother. Do you mind?" No, I didn't like the idea. I watched my mother grow smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the door of Dr. Gordon's office building. Then I watched her grow larger and larger as she came back to the car. Well, I could tell she had been crying. Dr. Gordon thinks you should have some shock treatments at his private hospital in Walton. Does he mean live there? You tell me the truth, I said, or I'll never speak to you again. Don't I always tell you the truth? My mother said, and burst into tears.
Plath's feminism, nurtured not only by Woolf's novels, but also by A Room of One's Own, grew stronger as her writing developed, and her journal entry from 1960 could almost be its epigraph. I really hunger for a study of my own, a stretch of time without distractions. She had underlined the references to it in Woolf's diary, and one can trace her portraits of the authoritarian male, from Henry and Sunday at the Mintons, through Harold and the Wishing Box, 1956, to Dr. Gordon in this extract from the Bell Jar, 1963. He is a figure of contempt, and the shock treatment that he authorizes and administers is a terrifying experience for Esther, as it had in fact been for Plath, and she refuses to return to his hospital. But as a sign of the improvement in the professional opportunities for women advocated in Woolf's Three Guineas, later in the novel, when Esther is in the fictional Maclean's hospital, Plath introduces Dr. Norton to take over her care, a sympathetic woman based on Plath's long-term psychotherapist, Dr. Ruth Boucher, who she first met at the actual Maclean's. In the novel, when further shock treatments are required, Dr. Norton will assure Esther that they will be nothing like what she had before, and that she will accompany her. She does, and after 5 sessions, Esther is well enough to leave hospital and will return to college, as Plath did. Over the few years, while struggling with Falcon Yard on her journey to becoming a novelist and searching for a narrative style, Plath had considered writing a prose poem, perhaps influenced by Bernard, the phrasemaker in The Waves, who had decided at one point about not needing to whip prose into poetry. Her fascination with the connections as well as the contrasts between her 2 main genres was shown in a talk called A Comparison that was written for a home service program, The World of Books, and broadcast in July 1962. It is perhaps a surprisingly light-hearted and witty contrast between the poet Plath and the novelist. She clearly has Woolf in mind, whose handling of time she had so appreciated in To the Lighthouse. The 2-line imagist poem that she quotes is Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro.
How I envy the novelist. I imagine him, better say her, for it is the woman I look to for parallel. I imagine her, then, pruning a rose bush with a large pair of shears, adjusting her spectacles, shuffling about among the teacups, humming, arranging ashtrays or babies, absorbing a slant of light, fresh edge to the weather, and piercing with a kind of modest X-ray vision the psychic interiors of her neighbours on trains, in the dentist's waiting room, in the corner tea shop. Her business is people in time. And she, it seems to me, has all the time in the world. I can take about a minute, so a poem takes place. And there really is so little room, so little time. The poet becomes an expert packer of suitcases. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. There it is, the beginning and the end in one breath. How would the novelist manage that? In a paragraph? In a page? Mixing it like paint with a little water, thinning it, spreading it out?
In the next 6 months, Plath would complete her aerial poems and leave them ready for publishing. And she would also publish The Bell Jar. Unconventionally, she had always sought a career as well as marriage and children. But in spite of so many literary doors opening for her, Plath would not live much longer. As early as 1950, when she was in her late teens, Woolf had already become, among others, an iconic figure for her, the embodiment of someone who had lived life fully. Here are 2 early extracts from her journal of 1950 and 52.
What is my life for, and what am I going to do with it? Some people live more than others. The life of a Willa Cather, a Lillian Hellman, a Virginia Woolf. Would it not be a series of rapid ascents and probing descents into shades and meaning, into more people, ideas, and conceptions? Would it not be in color rather than black and white, or more gray? I think it would. And thus, I, not being them, could try to be more like them, to listen, observe, and feel, and try to live more fully.
But 2 years later, as depression hovers,
I sit here, seeing the finger writing my hollow futility on the wall, the colossal waves sweeping tidal over me, drowning, drowning. This year I have had all I could ever ask, and there is the fallacy of existence, the idea that one could be happy forever with a given situation or series of accomplishments. Why did Virginia Woolf commit suicide.
We will never know if Plath mentioned Woolf in her last two journals, as Hughes destroyed one and mislaid the other, but I would be extremely surprised if she didn't. She had separated from Hughes, though not lost contact, in October '62, following his affair with Assia Weevil. He had returned to London while she stayed in Devon. But in December, she decided to rent 23 Fitzroy Road in London, where Yeats had once lived, and was very excited about that connection. But, and I think there were many reasons why, as a single mother of two, she simply could not cope. And just 2 months later, on the day before she died, she wrote to Dr. Ruth Boucher, who had been a very important figure for her now, for nearly 10 years. I am just scared I should just pull up the psychic shroud and give up. On March the 28th, 1941, Woolf's fear of going mad again became too strong to bear. On February the 11th, 1963, Plath could not face the admission to Halliwick Hospital, which Dr. Horder, fearful of sectioning her, had arranged for this day on which she took her life. Their circumstances were very different, but there were similarities. Both had produced very fine work in the preceding months. Both feared the imminent future, which Plath had envisioned in 1953 as an eternity of hell for the rest of my life in a mental hospital. And both left behind people they dearly loved. Woolf's very moving last letter to Leonard expresses deep gratitude as well as regret.
You have given me complete happiness, but I know that I shall never get over this, and I am wasting your life. All I want to say is that until this disease came on, we were perfectly happy. It was all due to you. No one could ever have been so good as you have been, from the very first day till now.
In her recent biography, Red Comet, Heather Clark has picked out Plath's short, little-known poem, Child, with its intimate revelation of depression's dark heart as the note she never left. 3 of her last post-aerial poems are about her children, and I think this one, written 2 weeks before she died, is probably addressed to Frida, who was nearly 3. In it, she distinguishes between what she would like to do, but simply cannot do, concluding by contrasting an image of the pool's potential richness with these 2 disturbing images, one of tense anxiety, this troublous wringing of hands, and one of utter bleakness, this dark ceiling without a star. Here is that poem, Child.
Your clear eye is the one absolutely beautiful thing. I want to fill it with colour and ducks, the zoo of the new, whose names you meditate. April snowdrop, Indian pipe, little, stalk without wrinkle, pool in which images should be grand and classical, not this troublous wringing of hands, this dark ceiling without a star.
I think it was her mother, Aurelia, who my heart still goes out to, who put it most truthfully when she wrote at the end of Letters Home, although she had for so long managed to be gallant and equal to the life experience, some darker day than usual had temporarily made it seem impossible to continue. But I want to conclude positively with an idea that I encountered in an early essay by Sandra Gilbert, one of the finest feminist critics I've encountered who has written about Plath. She suggests that W.B. Yeats, her favorite poet, whose spirit she felt blessing her, and Virginia Woolf, whose blessed diary she was in awe of, had become her sacred facilitators. Making of the moment something permanent was an idea Plath inherited from both of them. They had actually met twice, and it is conveyed in these 4 lines from a poem she wrote and dedicated to her friend Leonard Baskin, a sculptor she admired. While our bodies flicker towards extinction, his chisel bequeaths his sculptures life livelier than ours, a solider repose than death's. The books she left us are an impressive illustration of this solider repose than death, and there they are. But as Al Alvarez, the Observer's poetry editor and critic, said, and he knew her and her work as well as anyone at the end of her life, with her death, the loss to literature was immeasurable. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. And does anyone have a question? But mine doesn't work very well. I don't think the batteries are good.
Does that not? No, if you speak close.
Okay. Right.
Can we do the questions without the mic?
We need the mics for the people on Zoom, right?
Yes.
And then also Ian will be able to ask any that have been asked
From the
online.
Zoom, yes.
Do you have any already?
Not at the moment, so
Okay.
the audience in the room have it if they
Right.
want it.
Yes. Well, I think this is the thing, John. I think.
There's
Oh, good, right.
I don't know if it's really a question. Well, thank you. That was actually fantastic and very moving. Forgive me, because I don't know so much about Sylvia Plath. Was she quite ill? I mean, did she have this sort of like mental, I hate to use this word, mental illness, but, you know, was she quite like that before she actually met Ted Hughes? I mean, did Ted Hughes make it a lot worse? Or was she already... So what I'm trying to say is that Leonard Woolf was an absolute saint. Virginia Woolf, if she'd been married to any other man in 1913, she would have been put into an asylum. But that man, her husband, saved her life. And because of Leonard, we were able to then have all those brilliant Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, Room of One's Own, to the Lighthouse, the Waves, the years between the acts, it goes on. And it just seems to me so awful that, as you say, that Sylvia was so cut short, really, because she wasn't treated, I'm sorry, but she was not treated well by Ted Hughes. And it's just so awful that there was nobody else there to help her.
I think there's quite a lot of truth. I think I better get back to this. I think there's quite a lot of truth in what you say. The answer to the first bit of your lengthy question, yes, she was a very vulnerable person as her life developed. She was very upset when her father died for all sorts of reasons. And in her teens, she gradually became more inclined to depression. And 1953, which was her big breakdown, after a month in New York, which was in a way quite fun, although it was actually quite difficult, she came back and her mother told her virtually immediately she hadn't got on this course. And she was certain she would, and I don't know why she didn't, because she was a very, very good writer. There is, incidentally, far left, I think it is, yes, a new book of the collected prose of Sylvia Plath. It's taken 60 years for this to come out, and Johnny Panic and other pieces is a kind of distillation of that that's been around. But she was a very gifted writer, so she couldn't face that, and she got very depressed, self-harmed, worked in a hospital, thought of different ways of committing suicide, and then overdosed on her mother's sleeping tablets. 50 she took, very nearly died, was in two hospitals before Maclean's, and shock treatment did cure her. She got back to Smith's, and she led a fairly normal life. And the early years of her marriage, I think, were very happy. But there are dark things, and The Wishing Box may have a prophetic element in it, that short story. And she got involved with Dr. Ruth Busher, who she'd met in Maclean's in 53. In 58, 2 years into her marriage, she's seeing a psychotherapist very regularly. And early on, I think it's true to say, she got Ted Hughes up and running. She typed his pieces. She was very, very pragmatic in her writing. All her early short stories are designed for whatever magazine they were sent off to. So she got him up and running, and then he kind of overtook her in terms of reputation, and it started to create a bit of rivalry, I think. But when she came back to England, he wanted to move out of London initially, and she agreed to do that. But I gather it never worked for him. Not only did Asher Weaver arrive, and immediately things changed. Ted Hughes' mother, who Sylvia Plath could be quite patronizing about, was very fond of her and wrote to Aurelio when things were bad, "I will always be there for Sylvia." And she said Ted Hughes should never have treated her as he did. And some of the things were ruthless. Going off to Ireland while booking time in Spain and leaving her over there, and things like that. And she couldn't handle it. It pulled the rug from out of her life. Interestingly, I wasn't going to say this, but I'm quite glad you have. I have known one or two Leonard Woolfs. I won't go into any details. But Heather Clark, I haven't brought her 1,000-page biography called Red Comet. This is why I have a red file for Sylvia Plath. She was such a dynamic person. And for most of her life, red was her favorite color. So I've read recently, she turned to blue towards the end. But Red Comet is an amazing biography. How it didn't win the Pulitzer, I do not know, because it's a really difficult subject to write about. But she says she didn't have a Leonard Woolf. Now, I came across that statement in another area, which I'd like to mention. And I want to mention two writers. Quite by chance, about 6 months ago, I read for the second time a biography of Vivian Elliott. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. There are two. And it's quite unsympathetic to T.S. Eliot, who may have been gay, wore makeup, conspired with her brother, I think, to put Vivian in an asylum for the last 10 years of her life. And when she died, her brother couldn't forgive himself and said she was not mad, but you had to be kind to Vivi. On the celebratory day in America, when Ted Hughes met the family sort of thing, Wilbury Crockett, her high school teacher, didn't like him and wanted to kick him. He found him arrogant. I found that quite interesting. But her mother, Aurelia, said to Ted Hughes, "Will you be kind to her?" And I think she was vulnerable and needed kindness. I mean, what Leonard Woolf did, I think, is amazing. But I have met a second example of a Leonard Woolf. In the novel I mentioned, The Snake Pit, Sylvia Plath had reviewed the film in 1948 while at high school, which had Olivia de Havilland, and I think won a couple of Oscars. It's on YouTube. It's rather different to the novel, which I have looked at but haven't read. But the edition I've got has got a fascinating, I don't know what to call it, afterword, by a man who knew the author. I forget her name. Is it something like Margaret Ward, the Snake Pit authoress? But she went mad rather in the way that Virginia Woolf did, saying completely crazy things, as Septimus Smith does. But Sylvia Plath wasn't like that. She was more a depressive. And Margaret Ward, I'm going to call her husband, stood by her for the whole of her life. She went into serious psychiatric hospital time about 4 times, and he never lost faith in her. She visited something like 200 institutions, trying to spread the word that mental health is something we need to address seriously. So we can't all be Leonard Woolf. I mean, I think he's a saint. We sometimes use the phrase from an Anne Tyler novel, Saint Maybe, or Leonard Woolf would be head of that queue. But she was a very vulnerable person.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions in the room? Do you have any?
There was a follow-up on that, which just asked, I don't know, this is Robin, I don't know whether it's about, I presume it's about Plath, basically asking, in so many words, is it a case that her mental breakdown was exacerbated by a kind of suppression of a strong female personality?
I don't quite know what that means.
So, well, Robin says, was it madness or a way to suppress strong women? So I was interpreting that.
Is this 1953, the big breakdown?
I think it must be, yes.
No, I don't think it was, no. I think Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath were both born to write, and when they couldn't write, and when she failed this course, having thought she was a star, I think it was this being just dropped down. I don't think it was to do with the female identity.
Well, Ian, would you like to give our speaker and our...
To wrap up, so thank you, and apologies for just darting around like a guilty thing in the edges. They were just checking the microphones were working, so I'm hoping people on Zoom were able to follow all of that. That was absolutely extraordinary in terms of its effect, to have multiple speakers. Got very emotional at times, actually, so I think it's been a fantastic evening. And this is, we normally just have speakers, but to have speakers and readers, I think, has worked incredibly well this evening. We've had a great turnout in the room, we've had a great turnout online, so I think if we can all show our appreciation to both our speaker, but also to our 3 readers as well. Thank you.